A Chinese history, forged by rivers and bronze, a tale of China's ancient power. Episode 1. Was the territory of China once shrouded in enigma for the remainder of the ancient globe? Was the Silk Road a bridge between two realms, signifying that China held immense riches and influence? While these ancient societies experienced a dramatic collapse, China continued to thrive under numerous dynasties and sovereigns for millennia. To become the international powerhouse we recognize today, from constructing the longest edifice on the planet to witnessing the greatest and deadliest wars in recorded time, China stands as the most enduring unbroken civilization on Earth, its chronicles stretching back 5,000 years. It endured the ancient times, the medieval era, and now the present age. But is their legacy sustainable? To comprehend this captivating nation, we must begin at the origin. Prehistory. Most of the earliest Chinese communities began around the Yellow River Basin in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. Inhabitants established themselves on the fertile plains and led farming-centered lives, producing plenty of millet and rice. The conditions favored agriculture, yet a significant issue afflicted the newly prospering populations. Floods from the Yellow River repeatedly displaced or killed settlers and destroyed their harvests and shelters in the process. The terrain was unforgiving and unwelcoming, endangering their newly adopted lifestyle. This persisted until Yu, the engineer, the mythical and perhaps mythical figure, was given the duty of regulating the river's course. Yu was well aware that the waterways were not without reason the settlers' worst adversary. His father Gun had already spearheaded former attempts to tame the rivers and spent 10 years of his life erecting a system of barriers and embankments that ultimately failed. Regardless of how high the walls Gun and his men constructed, the river repeatedly prevailed. Yu, however, was not disheartened by his father's shortcomings. Instead, he was firmly resolved to achieve the tremendous mission. He recruited the assistance of Ho Ji, another semi-legendary farming innovator, credited with introducing millet to mankind. The duo collaborated on plans and eventually created a canal-style irrigation method. It directed the surplus floodwaters toward the ocean, while reserving some for reuse in farming. Thus, the development of the system finally concluded the flood era, and Yu the engineer was declared leader of China due to his grand achievement. Xia dynasty. This marked the beginning of the Yi dynasty, the trigger for the dynastic tradition in China. The kingdom and its lands thrived abundantly under Yu. They remain chiefly a farming-based civilization, but are acknowledged for the invention of numerous early Chinese creations, such as stone implements for farming and the lunar calendar. Eventually, Yu partitioned the territory into 9 regions, and although each was overseen by its own noble, they were obliged to stay loyal to Yu's authority. After many years of halting rivers and triumphing over rival tribes, old age and mortality drew near for Yu, raising the issue: what comes next? He resolved that he did not wish to hand leadership to his son Qi, but rather desired his minister of justice, Gao Yao, to take the throne. Tragically, Gao Yao passed away shortly afterward. Consequently, a tribal chieftain named Yi was selected to assume the role. The provincial nobles opposed this outcome. They had become deeply attached to the revered Yu over his 45-year reign as sovereign and insisted that his son Qi should succeed him. Their demand was ultimately fulfilled. Qi was the first Chinese monarch to ascend not through skill or talent, but due to his ancestry and ties. This hereditary model would persist for millennia. In the 16th century BC, the Xia dynasty ultimately met its demise. Perhaps his obsession with pleasure blinded him to the unrest brewing across his domain. There existed a philosophy in ancient China called the Mandate of Heaven, a seemingly poetic doctrine that claimed not only did heaven grant virtuous men the right to govern China, but also decreed that any wicked and unjust rulers would be removed. Clearly, heaven had a grievance with Jai. China transitioned into the Bronze Age, and, unfortunately for Jai, a rebellious faction armed with novel bronze weaponry arose. The Xia dynasty was swiftly dismantled by this group, which would come to be known as the Shang dynasty. Not only did they vanquish the corrupt King Jai and his followers, but the Shang dynasty still holds something the Xia lacked: a written legacy. The oracle bone texts were an early form of Chinese script and were typically carved into animal bones or turtle shells. There are over 3,000 recorded symbols from the Shang period, many of which remain in use or resemble today's Chinese characters. Given that the Shang dynasty reigned approximately 600 years ago, We possess an extraordinary amount of knowledge about daily customs and key traditions due to excavated findings like the oracle bones. The Shang people were fairly nomadic and often traveled to coastal regions and islands during their campaigns. And with each return, they brought back seashells, which served as money in their economy. They operated under a feudal structure that enriched the aristocrats and subjected the peasants and farmers to hardship. The impoverished had minimal authority, yet the army and regime were too powerful at the time to be challenged by the lower classes. The Shang rulers were deeply spiritual, and the senior priests held substantial sway over the territories. These priests emphasized the procedures surrounding death, dying, and burial, and created numerous rites to ensure their power and protection both in the mortal world and the afterlife. The Shang regime commanded a vast military and labor force, subjugating territory after territory and constructing major fortified cities as they advanced. It was an unstable era, rife with clashes against other tribes and internal strife that forced the Shang to relocate their capital 5 separate times. However, their expertise in forging bronze arms and chariot wheels enabled them to crush opposition and maintain dominance for roughly 6 centuries. In 1046 BC, the Zhou clan from the Wei Valley, a subordinate of the Shang, defied their rule during the Battle of Muye. The impoverished Chinese masses wholeheartedly supported the Zhou forces, and many enslaved people forced to fight for the faltering Shang switched allegiance to fight for the Zhou. Following this desperate stand, Di Xin retreated to his palace, surrounded himself with his riches, and set the building aflame, ending his life. With this conclusive triumph, the Zhou believed they had earned the mandate of heaven, which would now become a central tenet in Chinese political theory. Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty was the longest standing of China's imperial lineages. It lasted 789 years, from 1046 BC to 256 BC. The happenings during those nearly 8 centuries were among the most pivotal, not only in China's saga, but also in the formation of the modern world. This era was distinctly marked by innovation and transformation.